Deciding to move is never an easy decision. It's a home that you've probably spent like 5 years in, or in some cases even longer than that. But sometimes when life changes or life situations compel you to, you will have to either upgrade or downgrade your housing. And the biggest headache about this is transiting between properties. Whether it's the complex terminologies or the messy timelines, if you're not used to property transactions, this could be a major roadblock. Today we'll talk about the timelines and transiting between the various properties, and hopefully I can simplify it for you guys to better understand these timelines. Because maybe like me, you're kind of an introvert and is shy to reach out to an agent asking about this. And so I will do you a solid and go through the HDB and private property processes and timeline and how to transit between them. And in turn, if you find this video useful today, drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more of these property videos. Let's start with the HDB process and timelines. So assuming today a buyer with HFE found the house and negotiated the purchase price, the buyer will then transfer up to $1,000 to the seller in a form of option fee in exchange for the option to purchase document, or what we always call OTP. The buyer will then have 3 weeks to decide whether they are going to exercise the option. And with these terminologies, it may seem complicated, but the easiest way to remember this is that the buyers are granted the option or the right to buy the house, and 3 weeks later they can exercise that right to buy it, hence the terms option to purchase and exercise. And during these 3 periods, the buyer will have to do a few things. The first thing is submitting the valuation request to HDB, and this can take up to 1 to 2 weeks depending on whether there's a need for a physical valuation. And a little on this, HDB's valuation is like a black box, so we will never know what the results of the valuation are gonna be or how the prices are adjusted. We usually use past transactions in the area to gauge the rough valuation, because if the majority of prices are a certain way, then it is likely the accepted pricing range for majority of the buyers in that area for HDB's valuation. And now what happens if the valuation is lower than the offer price? The buyer will then be introduced to cash over valuation, or COV. The buyer will have to pay a mandatory component of cash, as the bank loan or HDB loan wouldn't cover it. As an example, if the buyer offered $750,000 for a flat and the valuation comes up to $720,000, that means that the buyer will have to pay $30,000 cash over valuation. And when the buyer is presented with this scenario, they will have 3 options. Number 1, to accept the COV and proceed with the exercising of the property. Number 2, reject the COV and just forfeit the option fee of $1,000 and walk away from the deal. And number 3, renegotiate the purchase price in a bid to lower or completely remove the COV. And take note that doing either option 2 or option 3 will result in the existing OTP being void for the entire 3 weeks duration, and the sellers will not be able to issue another option until after that period. Meaning, if today 1st of March is the day the option is issued, it will expire on 22nd of March. If the buyer decides not to exercise on 10th of March, for example, after seeing the valuation, the buyer would then be able to move on to the next property while forfeiting the $1,000 option fee. But the seller can only issue the next OTP on 23rd of March instead. And in the scenario where the buyer is renegotiating the price, it works the same way. Using the 1st March option issue date again, even if both parties agree to a lower price on 10th of March, the new OTP can only be dated on 23rd of March when the previous OTP has expired. Once the valuation is done, both parties are okay with it, we can move on to the next step where the buyer will need to handle their loan. If the buyer is taking a bank loan, this is when they will have to pass a scanned copy of the OTP and the HDB valuation report to the banker for an assessment of their loan, and also find a lawyer to represent them for this purchase. And take note that the buyer can only exercise on the flat once the bank loan or the letter of offer is accepted. On the flip side, if the buyer is taking a HDB loan and is using the HDB lawyers, then they may exercise the option right away. And for both options, the buyer can only exercise on the flat either on the day of the expiry or before that. They cannot exercise on the HDB after expiry. And to exercise the option, the buyer will then have to pay up to $4,000 and sign on the OTP as well. These These 1,000 and 4,000 that the buyer has paid up forms part of the HDB price. So this is not an additional amount to the house price. And in case you're wondering why is it $1,000 and $4,000, it is because a HDB option can only be a maximum of $1,000 and the option plus the exercise fee cannot exceed $5,000. And over time, this $5,000 has become a market norm. There are cases where sellers accept lower than $5,000, but it is very rare. And upon exercising, both parties would then have to submit the case to HDB, and in some cases, either parties may wish to delay this submission. For an example, if the sellers have not found their next house yet, they would like to create some buffer for them to do a house hunt. And in another scenario, perhaps the buyers have not sold their current house yet and would require it to be sold before proceeding with the submission. The submission to HDB may be delayed for up to 60 days, and not because of any rulings, but because each valuation report from HDB is only valid for 3 months. If you exceed this, you will need a fresh set of OTP and the valuation again to repeat the entire process. Once the submission is done, in approximately 3 weeks, HDB will send out a SMS for both parties to endorse the documents for sale. Both sellers and buyers will have to log in individually with their SingPass to do this step. And once done, it will take approximately 8 weeks for the completion to happen. At completion is where the buyer will pay the rest of the down payment less the initial $5,000 option and exercise fee, and the sellers will receive the cash proceeds according to their financial calculations. CPF will return 1 to 2 weeks later only. So as you can see, the HDB purchase timeline can be as short as 13 weeks, assuming that the option is exercised in 2 weeks, submitted immediately, and remaining 11 weeks for the HDB processes. But it can be as long as over 22 weeks if the buyer or the seller requires a 60-day submission period and the seller requires a 3 months extension. Now you would often hear of this term called extension, and some people get confused over this. The extension period only starts after completion, meaning you add another 3 months to the existing timeline. And these extensions are endorsed by HDB. It is rental free and aims to help people with the transition of properties. It will be reflected in your sales and purchase documents and also to IRAS for non-owner occupied tax rates. The seller, while enjoying free rental extension, would then be liable for the town council fees, the utilities, and also reimbursing the buyers for their non-owner occupied tax rates. Why non-owner occupied tax rates? Because at this point of completion, the house title would already be transferred to the buyer's name, and the sellers or the ex-owners at this point would then become occupants for 3 months. Hence, non-owner occupied tax rates. The other thing to take note of with this extension is that the buyer's MOP counter only starts after the extension. And so let's put a date to this to give you a sense of how long this process would take. Let's take 30th of March 2026 as the date we buy or sell the HDB. Using our fastest timeline, 30th of March is when the option is issued. 2 weeks later, the buyers proceed to exercise it. They submit the case on the same day, which means that 4th of May would be the endorsed document step. And with this initial timeline, it seems like the completion will be on 29th of June. And if extension is required, then the house will only be handed over to the buyer on the 29th of September. And using our slowest timeline, 30th of March, again, the option issue date, which means they take 3 weeks to exercise, which is on the 20th of April. 19th of June, submission, which is 60 days from 20th of April, which puts our endorsement on 10th of July and completion on the 4th of September. If extension is required in this case, then 4th of December is the date that the house will be handed over to the buyer. So imagine a buyer going for a house that he really likes this month and the sellers require a longer timeline. That means that the buyers will only be able to get their keys in December, and if he needs to renovate it, he will likely only move in a year from the day that he bought the house. So make sure you know what you're signing up for when negotiating for the price. And next, let's go through the private resale timeline. So assuming today the buyer once again found the house and negotiated the purchase price, this time round, the buyer will then transfer 1% of the property price to the seller in the form of option fee. And this is done in exchange for the option to purchase document. The buyer will now have 2 weeks instead to decide whether he is going to exercise the option. Why is this different from HDB? It's because there is no formal valuation session by an authority this time, and values are managed by banks based on surrounding transaction data. HDB's extra week of option is meant for their valuation process. And during these 2 weeks, the buyers will have to do a few things. They will need to find a bank to finance this property, and valuation rules still apply here. So if the bank cannot match the value of the property at the offer price, it means that COV will entail too. Though this is very rare for private properties because we will be able to get a banker to do the valuation of the property prior to offering for it, and the buyer will have to find a lawyer to represent him or her for the purchase and to also exercise the document. Take note that you can only use private lawyers for private properties. And some questions that you may have is that can the option period be longer or shorter than the 2 weeks? The answer is yes. Private transactions are a bit more flexible. It is a private arrangement between the buyer and the seller, and 2 weeks is the usual time norm to cater for loan approval. In some cases, when the buyer hasn't sold their house but really like the seller's property, they can also opt to go for a longer option period, like 2 months for an example, but of course that entails with a higher option fee of perhaps 3 to 5% instead of the 1%. Anyway, once all is in order, the buyer can then proceed with the exercising of the property. And this usually entails them going down to the lawyer's office to hand over a 4% cashier order. And this is also where the private resale processes branches off from the HDB process. In HDB, the buyer pays the buyer stamp duty within 2 weeks of endorsement, which could be 2 to 3 months from the date of the option, giving HDB or lawyers enough time to get CPF to approve the usage of funds for stamp duties. However, for private resale properties, you will have to pay your buyer stamp duty within 2 weeks of exercising, which could come as quickly as 2 to 4 weeks comparatively. Lawyers wouldn't have enough time to get CPF to approve the usage of funds, which means that the upfront cash required for a private property would be the 5% cash down payment and also another 4 to 6% of buyer stamp duties within 2 to 4 weeks from the date of option. And this is important for later when we start to merge the timelines. Completion will then be 10 weeks from exercising, or 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It's up to the buyer and seller. But take note that 8 weeks is very rushed for the banks and lawyers, and they would usually recommend 10 weeks at least instead. And completion is when the buyer pays the remaining of the down payment and when the mortgage or bank loan kicks in. In a private resale situation, if the seller needs extension past the completion dates, it can be discussed with the buyers, either a rent-free period and factor into the price, or paid through a monthly rental fee. And also just to touch a little bit on why is there this long duration before completion. As you can see in HDB or private properties, there is always a 8 to 10 weeks gap before you get your keys. To my knowledge, and asking the lawyers years ago, they explained to me that this was a time to write into CPF to request the usage of the funds for completion and also for the loan processing by the banks, which requires approval before disbursement. On top of the usual conveyance work like transferring of the title deeds, hence the usual 10 weeks of completion timeline. And now let's try merging the timelines for various scenarios. First up, we have the HDB to a HDB timeline. If you're selling a HDB and buying another HDB, your timeline will look like this if you're not using Contra. The easiest way to look at timelines is to make sure that your sales proceeds come in time for your purchase completion, where the remaining down payment is required. And remember, we said earlier that CPF takes 1 to 2 weeks to come in after completion, so cater a 3 weeks buffer period between the completion of both properties so that the legal side will have enough time to put up the request to CPF. And for this case, some people will opt out of the Contra scheme because it forces them to take a second HDB loan, and that will cause them to lose 50% of their sales proceeds into the next house that they are buying. But if you want a hassle-free experience and are dumping all of your proceeds into the next house you're buying anyway, then yes, just use Contra and the timeline will look like this. And next, HDB to private properties. If you're selling a HDB and buying a private property, your timeline will look like this. The goal here is the same, is to make sure that your HDB proceeds come in time for the private completion when the remaining down payment is required. And while you stay in the HDB for 3 months extension, you can also start renovating your private property and then moving in before your 3 months extension is up. And because the private property timeline is shorter than that of the HDB, you can slowly shop for a private property before deciding on one. But as you can see, when you sell your HDB, you are only receiving $5,000 in total for the option and exercise fee. But for the private side, you will have to come up with a sizable amount, meaning that for your resale private purchase, you will have to come up with the 5% option and exercise fee and also the 4 to 6% buyer stamp duty with your own cash savings. And this is necessary if you want a seamless transition to the next property. So if you're planning to do a HDB to a resale private transaction, then account for this initial upfront payment. And if you can't afford the initial upfront payment, you can perhaps adopt a timeline like this. Assuming that the private property is ready for move-in, the 3 months extension timeline will allow you to start the process of the private property purchase immediately after the HDB completion period. And even if you don't get a 3 months extension on the house that you're selling and need a temporary location to stay in, you can also choose to stay at service apartments or short-term rental private properties. So it is still very possible for you to upgrade to a private property if you really want to. But the downside to doing it like that is the hassle of moving twice, because you will have to move from your HDB to the temporary location of stay and then move on to your private property once completion or renovation is done. And now moving on, if you're selling a private and buying a private, then your timeline will look like this. Take note that once again, you will have to pay upfront for the 5% option and exercise fee and 4 to 6% stamp duties without the proceeds of your existing house. And again, it's the same thing. Just make sure that your buying completion is 3 weeks after the selling completion so that the money flows right. And get an extension of stay if you want the seamless transfer. If you're selling a private property and buying a HDB, this one trick question, but with the existing policies at the point of this recording, you still have to deal with the 15-month wait out period, which means that you will have to offload your private property, stay somewhere else for 15 months, then apply for the HFE and then buy your HDB. The only exceptions to this ruling as of now are those above 55 years old downgrading and buying a 4-room flat or smaller. If that is your case, then yes, you will be exempted from this ruling. And before this ruling came out, most of the downgraders I serve would just proceed to buy the HDB first, then proceed to sell their private property. Why? Because there is no ABSD charge when you're downgrading from a private property to a HDB, and because the HDB timeline is a lot longer than the private one, meaning that from the point you purchase your HDB, you will have at least 1.5 months to sell your private property and potentially stretching up to 3.5 months depending on the number of days for submission. But seeing how the HDB resale market has been going, there is a chance where this rule gets removed soon to bring back demand to the HDB resale market. So yes, this video is to give you a preview to help you understand timeline management when transiting between various properties. And as you can see, this process is fairly simple once you understand the core of it, which is the 3 weeks gap between both transactions and also the utilization of extension when required. It is also to show you that it is still possible to upgrade to the next property even if you have issues with your initial cash flow, especially when upgrading to a private property. But again, this is assuming that you are not buying out of your reach and buying responsibly within your TDSR. Never overstretch or overcommit to this big ticket item and turn your life upside down and end up eating grass. If you found this video useful and would like to learn more, you can drop me a DM at 96971000. I do have a few more tools that will aid in your property moves within these consolidated spreadsheets. This allows you to track seamless timelines and also the selling and buying scenarios with auto calculations to be readily prepared for transition. And if you like this video, subscribe to the channel. We release real estate videos weekly. I'm ASAP and I will see you in the next video.